Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful late summer day. I think everybody here gets a gold star. We'll be handing them out at the end of the lecture. We really appreciate your coming out on such a beautiful day. I'm Frank Goodyear, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture with Eleanor Harvey, a senior curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We are simply thrilled to have Eleanor here. As we've been trying to get her here to Bowdoin for some time now. 2 years ago, she was scheduled to speak about the art of the American Civil War in conjunction with an exhibition that the Bowdoin Museum had organized on this subject. However, the federal government decided to shut down on the day that she was scheduled to travel, and as a Smithsonian employee, Eleanor was not allowed to travel, and we had to cancel the program. We've been looking for an opportunity to get her back ever since, and on this occasion have made sure to schedule her lecture before the October 1st deadline for the government to approve a budget. Eleanor Harvey is the go-to person for anything related to the art of the American Civil War as a result of her research on the groundbreaking project, The Civil War and American Art, an exhibition that she curated that opened at the Smithsonian in the fall of 2012 and traveled the following year to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In that exhibition, Eleanor argued persuasively that American artists, important American artists, did not sit out the war, as previous historians had suggested, but that artists from both the North and the South were deeply engaged with the events of the war and the larger issues at that conflict's core. Yet, Eleanor's research in the field of American art goes much deeper than the Civil War. Having done her undergraduate work at the University of Virginia, where she majored in geology, important for somebody who's interested in landscape, and having done her PhD at Yale, she worked initially as a curator at the Dallas Museum of Art before joining the Smithsonian in 2003. There, she has specialized in 19th century American painting with a particular interest in the history of landscape painting, and she can really tell you what rocks are in all of these pictures. Given that many of the artists in our exhibition, Night Vision, had a fascination with depicting the outdoor landscape at night, we knew that Eleanor would be a great person to bring to Bowdoin to add a further perspective about this exhibition. Having enjoyed a wonderful lecture by Alex Nemiroff and a gallery conversation with Linda Doherty earlier this week, we are thrilled to have Eleanor here to provide a third scholarly take on Night Vision. Next week, two artists arrive to provide their perspectives on Night Vision. Please be sure to join us on Monday for a conversation between the poet Vincent Katz and the artist Richard Bossman, and next Thursday for an exchange between curator Joachim Hohmann and the filmmaker Michel O'Day, whose video installation in the museum's new media gallery provides a really interesting contemporary counterpoint to Night Vision. That said, this week is for the historians. Without further ado, please welcome Eleanor Harvey.
Thank you very much. It is truly a pleasure to be here. I have no idea whether I'll be in the office on October 1st this year either, but that's not for me to say. What I'm here to do tonight, though, is to speak to you a little bit about the works of art that were made during and after the American Civil War, truly one of the darkest moments in our history. What was called at the time the Second American Revolution reset the terms of our democracy. The night sky 150 years ago was a far different experience than what most of us see when we walk outside, an animated field of stars and planets, meteors and auroras that provided a nightly reminder of how much we still did not know about our universe. It's little wonder then that Nocturnes served in a powerful role in the art and literature of the mid-19th century. The invocation of darkness is literal, metaphorical, scientific, and lyrical by turn. I'd like to explore today how darkness, as a concept and as an atmospheric condition, functioned during the Civil War years. In March of 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, Sanford Gifford displayed this painting, which he titled Twilight in the Catskills. The brooding landscape did not speak of the glories of God in the wilderness, nor did it rejoice in the spiritual regeneration that Hudson River School artists typically felt in their beloved Catskills. Instead, Gifford vested in his twilight a sense of destruction and loss, underscored by the stands of trees framing the view. They're not simply dead trees, but the victims of fire. Their scarred remains speak of violence to the landscape that is unusual in American art from this period. Their jarring presence forces the viewer to look beyond the sweeping view for meaning. Gifford is alone in describing this kind of destruction to the land at this moment, deliberately introducing a disquieting note associated with death to an otherwise luminous sunset. A stream, painted to look more like molten rock than water, bisects the foreground, the cascade descending in silence to the valley floor below. A reviewer for the New York Tribune, mesmerized by this painting, described it as darkness visible, a construction he took from Milton's Paradise Lost, which he fully expected his audience to recognize. The dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible. The Civil War years are a time when darkness took on added resonance in the hands of artists for whom sunsets long provided a trumpet voluntary at the end of another spectacular day. At this time in our history, our concept of nature, bound up in the features and the moods of the American landscape, served as a powerful metaphor for the state of the nation. And literature provided the verbal key to the visual drama. In Gifford's painting, it is not quite yet night. Twilight is the moment before darkness falls. And the passage from Milton is concerned with Lucifer's fall, as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole, in Milton's words. Gifford's evocation of darkness visible constitutes an elegy for the passing of an era, the passage from peace to war, from unencumbered appreciation of the mountains Gifford loved to a growing sense of melancholy that this new Eden was on the brink of destruction without the promise of renewal. At this moment in American art, artists invested the night and the onset of darkness with the mood of impending crisis. The night sky became a backdrop for omens. War was declared on April 12, 1861, and by May 19th, Frederick Church was at work on his first and only intentional Civil War painting, Our Banner in the Sky. After the lowering of the American flag over Fort Sumter, the North was consumed by flag imagery, and Church's painting was declared our first war picture by the New York newspapers. But the reason I include it here has to do with its backstory. On June 10th, Church's friend, the rising literary star Theodore Winthrop, became the first Union officer to die in battle at Big Bethel in Virginia. Winthrop had written the broadside for Church's great painting, The Heart of the Andes, and spent the weeks leading up to the declaration of war in Church's studio, where he and George Curtis, the editor of Harper's Weekly, talked of nothing else, in Curtis's words. Winthrop could not wait to enlist when war broke out. Stationed in Washington, though, he soon tired of the inaction and got himself reassigned to Benjamin Butler's forces at Fortress Monroe near Norfolk. Charged with flushing out Confederates hiding nearby, Winthrop did something really stupid. He dismounted his horse, stood on top of a fallen log, sword drawn to rally his men, and a North Carolina sharpshooter brought him down with a single bullet to the chest. Back in New York, Church read with increasing dread the reports that at first listed his gallant friend among the missing, and after 3 agonizing days, confirmed among the dead. Winthrop's death stunned the cultural world in New York City. Frederick Church reeled from the loss, unable any longer to keep the deadly conflict at an intellectual arm's length. With Winthrop's death, Our Banner in the Sky accrued a more meaningful and mournful layer of meaning, soberly encompassing loss as well as triumph. For this small work, Church clearly borrowed the palette and the composition from his painting of 1860, Twilight in the Wilderness. Quoting from the intense reds and oranges in the sky, Church took an evocative sunset and adapted it to become nature's memorial, the very landscape seeming to mourn the dissolution of the Union, the state of the nation like the edge of the flag in tatters. But Church had a more personal reason to borrow from this specific sunset. because it commemorated the last trip that Church and Winthrop took together to Maine in the summer of 1856. It was a trip during which, after canoeing around Mount Katahdin, they stopped in Portland to hear presidential candidate John C. Fremont speak. Fremont was an anti-slavery candidate, Winthrop's choice for president, who would eventually lose to James Buchanan in the general election in the fall. Winthrop's hopes for the nation rode on that speech, his enthusiasm for enlisting a consequence of Fremont's loss. Church then invested in this small oil sketch all of the emotion he could bring to bear, turning a patriotic gesture into a personal ensign to commemorate the loss of his friend. Our banner in the sky, with its lurid, high-keyed color, tattered flag, and overt patriotic symbolism, is a memento of loss, conflating the national calamity with his own personal grief. The summer and early fall of 1860 was an unusually active time for atmospheric phenomenon. Comets, meteors, even the aurora borealis was visible up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Newspaper articles and letters to the editor spoke to the broad ripple of unease and fear associated with these events. On July 20th, a meteor streaked across the eastern sky. But it was no ordinary meteor. You've seen shooting stars. It's a quick streak of light that looks like it's falling from the skies, and it's over in an instant. But this was an unusual earth-grazing meteor that took over 30 seconds to sail overhead. 30 seconds is a really long time to watch something streak across the sky. Please. As an example, in 2013, a similar meteor streaked across Russia. This is when we discovered they all had dashboard cams in Russia. Everyone thought the meteor was a rocket. There was a sonic boom, it flew low in the atmosphere and in broad daylight. In 1860, the renowned astronomy professor W.H.C. Bartlett at West Point observed it and resembled a fire balloon propelled by the feeble burning of a rocket. Its remarkably low altitude prompting him to think that it was some new and marvelously successful pyrotechnic device fired from the western hills. The metaphors constantly invoked artillery as though the very skies were already at war. The cover page of Harper's Weekly on Saturday, August 4th, ran 3 wood-engraved images of the meteor as its lead story. Church witnessed this strange display and captured the beginning of the meteor's breakup in this small, unearthly painting. Now, although we are a nation enamored of the sciences, America still looked to religion to help explain the unexplainable. The Bible served up parables of divine retribution in the antics of the sky. In the North, abolitionists feared God was angry that they had not done enough to abolish slavery. In the South, the sky became a specter for the fear of Northern retribution. And among millions of African Americans, both enslaved and free, word of the meteor provided an emblem of possible liberation and justice. Because during the 1850s, the meteors had already come to be associated with the abolitionist John Brown, the man whose actions many consider to have triggered the Civil War. Contemporary poets likened the abolitionist to a meteor, his fiery trajectory across the political landscape compared to that of celestial bodies. His raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 and his subsequent execution became a flare in the night, an omen of the strife yet to come. Writer Herman Melville penned a poem linking the meteors of 1859 with John Brown, portraying him as an equally disturbing force of nature. Melville closed his poem, The Portent, with lines comparing Brown's beard with the tail of a meteor. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. Melville's cryptic phrases recognized that this strange celestial sighting, like Brown's raid, had upended nocturnal stargazing and suffused even that pastime with unease. Walt Whitman also witnessed the earth-grazing meteor that inspired Church's painting. His poem of 1860 is titled Year of Meteors, 1859 to 60. In it, he reflects on Lincoln's election, to Brown's hanging, proclaiming, "Year of meteors, brooding year, I would bind in words retrospective some of your deeds and signs. I would sing how an old man, tall with white hair, mounted the scaffold in Virginia." Whitman reiterated the connection between the effect of Brown's actions and the appearance of this particular meteor, comparing Brown to the comet that came unannounced Out of the north, flaring in heaven, the strange, huge meteor procession, dazzling and clear, shooting over our heads. A moment long, it sailed its balls of unearthly light over our heads, then departed, dropped in the night, and was gone. For Whitman, John Brown was the meteor in the night sky, the portent of unavoidable sectional strife centered on the issue of slavery. Henry David Thoreau wrote a eulogy delivered at Brown's grave in North Elba on July 4th, declaring, "The last 6 weeks of his life was meteor-like, flashing through the darkness in which we live. I know of nothing so miraculous in our history." That darkness in Church's hands became a soft purple shot with gold. The inspiration for its palette, its color, and its mood was his mentor Thomas Cole's fifth and final painting called Desolation, from the monumental series, The Course of Empire, in which the moon casts a wan reflection on the water as man's empire has crumbled into ruins and nature seems poised to reclaim what man has destroyed. A similar sobriety infuses Church's small painting, parallels that would have resonated among Church's friends, colleagues, and patrons. The war years proved to be a bounty for celestial portents. The preponderance of meteors, comets, and auroras made it seem as though the American skies, north and south, were witness to an apocalyptic battle overhead that rivaled the actual battles on the ground. Chief among the phenomenon invoking apocalypse and days of judgment were the aurora borealis, eerie electrical pulses that gave rise to fears of nature out of control, appearing and disappearing without warning. From the 1850s, the appearance of the auroras spurred lengthy accounts in local newspapers that combined scientific data with astrological interpretations. In 1860, polar explorer Isaac Israel Hayes outfitted an expedition on a vessel he had had Congress recently rechristened the SS United States. He wintered over, trapped in the Arctic ice pack. His safe return in October 1861 was a cause for celebration, a rare bright spot in a winter dark with war. The SS United States had survived an Arctic winter and returned intact, which was more than could be said for its namesake, the ship of state. At a lecture on his experience, Hayes ruefully noted, "Since we last met in this hall, great changes have taken place. When I left the regions of eternal ice, I little dreamed that a powerful rebellion was desolating my country and that civil war was raging among a people whom I left prosperous and happy. This great national calamity alters the relations under which we now meet. God willing, I trust yet to carry the flag of our great republic with not a single star erased from its glorious union to the extreme northern limits of the world." Hayes cast polar exploration as a form of patriotism and endurance as a northern value. No less a figure than Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote passionately about the need to fight to abolish slavery, using Arctic and tropical imagery to embody the polarities of the conflict. In his poem Voluntaries, which I have to admit is not his best piece of work, published in 1863, he should stick to essays, he described enslaved blacks as the offspring of the sun, yearning for freedom's flag on which the snowflake is her banner's star, her stripes the boreal streamers are. In Emerson's poem, the stars and stripes of the American flag are writ large in the northern skies, snowflakes, stars, and auroras. Icebergs and the Arctic became powerful metaphors for the righteousness of the Union cause and for the inevitability of the end of slavery. Framed against this backdrop, Church's painting took shape on his easel during the winter of 1864. Under a dark Arctic sky, Hayes's ship lies frozen in the ice pack. There's the dog sled down there, at the base of a looming cliff. As the ice grips the SS United States and by proxy the nation, the auroras snake across the Arctic winter sky like a grim warning from God, a bleak foreshadowing of doom. By this time, it is difficult, if not impossible, to find a description of an aurora that did not link it in some way with the war. In the North, a cartoon printed in Harper's Weekly shows a Confederate general cowering at the advancing northern lights, which appear as the oncoming Union Army, bayonets fixed. The auroras themselves lent themselves to yet another layer of foreboding, a metaphorical meaning drawn from the Bible, evoking the handwriting on the wall from the story of Belshazzar's feast. A cartoon published in this case by Currier and Ives shows Jefferson Davis identified as the modern Belshazzar, recoiling from just such a message intended to presage his downfall. In this idiom, the South is cast as a modern Babylon ripe for destruction for its continued advocacy of slavery and its disloyalty to the Union. In Church's Aurora Borealis, the eerie and silent nocturnal illumination that sways and ripples across the sky might also be taken for the illuminated words that spelled out Belshazzar's doom. Church's auroras, like the handwriting on the wall, spelled out the nation's apocalyptic fear that the skies warned of imminent judgment. Belshazzar's feast, as it turns out, was a popular metaphor at this time. Church's friend, the composer Louis Gottschalk, was writing a libretto for Belshazzar's feast as Church worked on the painting. Fear of a final retribution, however, lay behind much of the public nervousness expressed over the continued appearance of the auroras during the war years, encouraging apocalyptic interpretations of the phenomenon. Hayes spoke eloquently and extensively about the brilliant auroras he witnessed on his trip, emphasizing their overtones, noting that the strange light, in his words, glowed as if the air were filled with charnel meteors, pulsating with wild inconstancy over some vast, illimitable city of the dead. Church's Aurora Borealis is suffused with this vision of the Arctic night, rendering this illimitable place with a powerful sense of melancholy and discord. Church's auroras are silent flickerings of lurid light rippling across the sky like a nocturnal, unhinged rainbow. Artist and explorer present the Arctic as an unearthly landscape that functions as the inverse of paradise, a term usually ascribed to Church's Niagara Falls with its rainbow of promise over the cataract of Niagara. Abraham Lincoln's first order after the onset of the war was to fortify the city of Washington against Confederate attacks. Under cover of darkness, the night of May 24, 1861, federal troops crossed the Long Bridge, better known to those of us D.C. locals as the 14th Street Bridge, into Alexandria. Winslow Homer captured that dramatic decision in an engraving for Harper's Weekly, in which the full moon provides the illumination for the men. That night, Elmer Ellsworth would die removing a giant Confederate flag from the roof of a tavern in Old Town and become a martyr for the Union cause. But it's the moon that captures my attention, a moon set against scudding clouds that derives from an 18th century idiom that remained a staple feature in British and American painting for more than a century, popularized by the 18th century British artist Joseph Wright of Derby, whose career often centered around evocative images of nocturnal landscapes. Matlock Tor was one of Wright of Derby's favorite haunts, in part for its bucolic beauty and for the dissonant note as the location of Richard Arkwright's cotton mills, mills that a century later would await the arrival of Confederate cotton that chased the blockades. What unnerved so many of Wright of Derby's contemporaries was not the mills themselves, but Arkwright's installation of gas lights to run night shifts, a clear violation of circadian rhythm, spurring elaborate conspiracy theories as to the possible nefarious activities going on within. In Wright of Derby's paintings, unnatural or misunderstood human activity is conducted by moonlight. Unease was a byproduct of a number of his most successful paintings, which, as it turns out, left me pondering and not really solving what has to be one of the strangest paintings made during the American Civil War, James Beard's The Night Before the Battle, in which the stark moonlight reveals a skeletal form grinning, its hand caressing the barrel of the cannon as it surveys the enemy's position. Union troops slumber unawares, one with an American flag across his lap, the lone sentry you may just be able to make out on the parapet with his back turned to the spectral presence. So does the skeleton disappear as in Pirates of the Caribbean when the moon hides behind the clouds? Is its presence real? Is it conjured by the men's dreams? Or is it the artist's commentary on death looking to swell its own ranks in the morning? No one has satisfactorily interpreted exactly what Beard has done here, but moonlight has become the powerful element in this artist's arsenal. The same night that Elmer Ellsworth's troops marched across the Long Bridge, the New York 7th Regiment also made that crossing, but they diverted into Arlington to build the ramparts of Fort Runyon, one of 31 perimeter forts intended to protect the city, this one at the base of the hill surmounted by the Custis Lee Mansion. Sanford Gifford wrote of the backbreaking work during the day and the relief with which the men ended their labors and set up camp. In Gifford's finished painting of the scene, the soldiers gather around crackling campfires, clustered under the protective canopy of the trees. Dimly discerned figures move about the copse. The moon shines overhead, balancing the light from the campfires glinting on stacked rifles. Gifford focuses not on military activity, but on the quiet moments of camaraderie that bring together soldiers who barely know each other, but whose shared belief in a cause unites them just the same. Similarly, Winslow Homer found camp scenes conveyed the essential humanity of the war, evident in this nocturnal view of Francis Barlow's company quartered outside of Yorktown in the fall of 1861. Huddled against the night chill, 5 Union soldiers share a quiet moment warmed by a campfire, sheltered by pine boughs and army blankets. Their mood is contemplative. Only their uniforms indicate their shared purpose. Night often provided the only time for rest and solitude and reflection for soldiers. Sanford Gifford's second summer in uniform saw the 7th stationed outside of Baltimore at Fort Federal Hill near the Inner Harbor. The rising sun and low morning mist silhouette the spars of countless boats, and the sentry's bayoneted rifle echoes the staccato array. The light is muted and carries the early morning chill. The brushwork is vibrant and animated as the artist's strokes dance across the surface. The sketch captures a glorious moment of private pleasure at the near silence of a dawning day. That quality of intimacy, along with the artist's brushwork and light touch, contribute to its powerful appeal. Gifford's temperament embraced the quality of solitude associated with guard duty. A fellow soldier from the 7th, Frank Dury, would go on to wax eloquent over its opportunities. It was the time for the sentry, pacing his lonely beat, to commune with his own soul, to think of home and friends and all that were dear to him, or perhaps longing that some favorite and loved one could be by his side. Such a night, to many a true and reverent hero, was the time when he could look up to the placid moon and the radiant stars and have his soul filled with glorious and holy thoughts of the world beyond, where the conflict of earth would at length be ended. Gifford or his surrogate stands on the parapet, alone with his thoughts on a quiet night, watching the pre-dawn glow over the city. That aura of watchfulness brings to mind what is undoubtedly the most celebrated painting in this idiom, Rembrandt's The Night Watch, in which the company patrols the streets, their presence designed to instill confidence in the local residents, a reminder that the night has always been a time requiring vigilance and loyalty, key concepts in this moment in American history. Gifford, like so many of his colleagues, was decently steeped in European history and art, having traveled extensively overseas to study works of art in England, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Italy during the 1850s, specifically to look at art and paint the landscape. Thus, the compositional strategy in his bivouac of the 7th Regiment is carefully constructed, playing the silvery moonlight off against the warmth of the campfire. By this time, that contrast between firelight and moonlight was a well-established trope in the art world, and in fact, Gifford's original title for this painting was Moon and Firelight, a duality explored in several variations on a theme by our friend Wright of Derby, usually the eruption of Vesuvius set against the light of a full moon. Gifford is hardly the only American artist to have made use of this idiom. In your exhibition here, Night Vision, Bierstadt's Burning Ship pays homage to this. And at the same moment when Gifford is painting his nocturnal camp scene, Bierstadt takes the idiom west, setting a frontier trapper's camp under the same full moon. I could have constructed an entire lecture around the use of this dichotomy, but we have more ground to cover and more nights to explore. Thomas Cole certainly knew of Wright of Derby's work, and his epic painting of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden situates the erupting volcano, right back here, as a backdrop to the judgmental shaft of light that banishes all of mankind from the garden. But Cole titled the oil sketch for this picture, Moon and Firelight, the same title Gifford would use on his own nocturnal camp scene. Cole's influence on the next generation of artists was strong, enough so that when John Ferguson Weir ended up painting two pictures of technological advances made during the Civil War, the gun foundry and forging the shaft, it's no coincidence that the strong shaft of light representing the molten metal to make the Parrott guns recalls God's displeasure at Adam and Eve. Our expulsion of the garden from the garden finds visual resonance in the production of machines capable of mass slaughter, made in the darkness that in this case is both emotional and metaphorical. The interior nocturne, if you will, provides a sobering counterpoint to that of the natural world, a commentary on man's capacity for self-destruction that suggests another twist on Milton's darkness visible. Darkness, the darkness of the soul, of our nation, plays out as an allegory of expulsion and our search for redemption, for a way back into the garden. But darkness as a venue for new technology brings us back to Wright of Derby, from the nocturnal activity of Arkwright's mill to that of Weir's gun foundry at West Point, with its round-the-clock production of weapons for the Union Army. The deep foreboding we associate with these scenes aligns with the actual misgivings about the ethics of man's experimentations, best seen in Wright of Derby's Experiment on a Bird in an Air Pump, in which a seemingly mad scientist in a dressing gown and long unkempt hair holds the bird's life literally in his hands. It's slumped over. You have actually a lovely air pump upstairs in the galleries. Take a look at it the next time you're up there, along with the diagram for how it works, because this is clearly the tabletop model. But what you have here is a slumped over bird, here in the base of this large piece here, and another one down here, and the idea is, will they live or die? As the attendant children look on with dismay, a young boy opens the curtains to reveal the full moon, our constant companion in scenes where we consider the ethics of our behavior and contemplate the consequences of our actions. Wright of Derby's inspiration for many of his nocturnal scenes was the self-named Lunar Society, active in England during the waning years of the Enlightenment, with tentacles stretching to France and to the United States. Foremost among its members were scientists who dared to dream of electric lights and paved streets, which would have made it easier for them to get to their meetings, which took place on the night of a full moon in Birmingham, England, hence their name. The Lunar Society espoused ideas balanced on the fulcrum of science and sacrilege, the ethical issues accompanying light in the darkness, the wisdom of placing the power of life and death in human hands. Charles Darwin's two grandfathers, Erasmus Darwin and Josiah Wedgwood, were active members of the Lunar Society, as were James Watt, Matthew Boulton, Joseph Priestley, and Joseph Wright of Derby. Their science was conducted under cover of darkness, out of the eyes of a suspicious monarchy, and their members corresponded with Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia and Antoine Lavoisier in Paris. Their story actually is very elegantly told in a book by Jenny Uglow called The Lunar Men, and if you aren't familiar with it, I highly recommend it for understanding art and science at the edge of the Enlightenment. But that dichotomy of operating by moonlight, using the light of the moon to aid them both in reaching their nocturnal rendezvous and scheming to electrify the streets to make that task easier, give us the framework to see a similar strangeness in the shift from Arkwright's mill to Beard's Night Before the Battle to Winslow Homer, in which a searchlight, an electrical searchlight, over the Cuban harbor is the means by which a key element of the Spanish-American War at the end of the century would be won. And so you go from a moon that is half obscured, where you have a searchlight beacon literally stretching up almost as though it is out of the water, gives you that shift from the foreboding aspect of nature's electrical rhythms, personified by the aurora borealis, to Homer's man-made electrical impulses cutting through the darkness, is what spurred the Lunar Men. For our purposes, it really is electricity that stood for their quest to shed light in the darkness and to confront the consequences of illuminating the dark corners of factories, forges, and the human mind. Wright of Derby's paintings provided a visual framework for the ways in which American artists used the night and the absence of light to describe in visual terms the state of mind during the American Civil War. Ironically, it is the introduction of electricity in America that changes the value of night in American art, threatening to distance us from nature's rhythms. At the close of the 19th century, Abbot Henderson Thayer fought hard to keep the Lunar Society's twin objectives of paved roads and electric streetlights from invading his beloved Mount Monadnock and turning off the darkness. He feared a sky without visible stars. He feared losing this. He feared a world where light canceled out the darkness, and the night sky simply became dark blankness rather than a vibrant backdrop for understanding and questioning our lives. His was not an irrational fear. Walk outside, look up, and at night you might see a tiny pinpoint of a star or two. But I just returned from 2 weeks in the northern New Mexico mountains, where the sky in the back country resembles Georgia O'Keeffe's Lawrence tree, an intoxicating swirl of stars that is disorienting in their unexpected profusion and magnificent in their luminosity. It's now hard enough to find a sky like this that the National Park Service has actually developed dark sky parks. At the upper left here, you see the network of electric lights seen from a satellite above across the United States, ironically looking a lot like a galaxy full of stars. Electricity has created an inversion of the night sky. What we see from an airplane is more like what our ancestors saw from the ground. Thayer dreaded a world reduced to daylight as its only idiom. But 150 years ago, the stars, the auroras, meteors, darkness, twilight, moonlight, and firelight illuminated the thoughts and feelings of a generation scarred by civil war, a generation that looked to nature to understand their place in the world and to the night sky as an expression of their hopes and fears in an uncertain time. May we all cherish the night sky and take comfort in its varied illumination as we consider our own place in the world. Thank you. I would be more than happy to take questions if you have any. Yes? I would be happy to. What you have here is Frederick Church's Meteor of 1860 is still in private hands, although if I have my way, I'd kind of like to see it with a Smithsonian credit line on it at some point. The Aurora Borealis is in the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. Our banner in the sky is also still in private hands. Homer's in front of Yorktown is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. I don't actually remember who owns the James Beard Night Before the Battle. The Gifford Bivouac is owned by the 7th Regiment in New York and is on view in the Luce Study Center, or actually it may be now in the American Wing Galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Twilight in the Catskills is at the Yale University Art Gallery. Yes?
Hi, I was really impressed with Cole's expulsion.
Yeah.
But do you know how you came up with that image? Because that doesn't really seem like a garden.
No, actually, it doesn't look like a garden. And what's fascinating about it is if you look at, if we can duck the house lights just once so that we can see the painting itself. Can you guys duck the house lights? Maybe. Thank you. What you see over here on this side is the Garden of Eden, and it's got large gemstones sticking out of the stream, because of course that happens. And you've got these sort of wonderful palm trees, and you've got Mount Chocorua in New Hampshire, because why not? Actually, in this painting of the Garden of Eden, which is in the Amon Carter Museum, it is Mount Chocorua, which the New Hampshireites are very proud of. But yeah, Nocturnes is in the Garden of Eden, and you can argue that with them, okay? I'm sure you've got places that, we could do Katahdin, that would work for me. And then you have this sort of fabulous gateway that looks like something out of Ghostbusters. And you've got this bridge that comes across here, and Adam and Eve are right down here, these two little tiny figures who are basically being chased out by a booming voice and a beacon of light. There is the Eye of Sauron up in the back, erupting over a thunderstorm, because of course it's nice and clear in Eden, but it's not out in the real world. And here's this cataract, which is this huge waterfall coming down from I'm not quite sure where. And then of course you have no real path once you're out there. And it is of course metaphorically laden with everything was just fine over here. The water flows in a nice pleasant fashion, it won't kill you. It's a landscape that is truly utopian, and there on the other side is what happens when you make a mistake. So the idea in American landscape painting is really to get back to the garden. The idea is to construct a national imperative around that. Cole liked those ideas. A lot of his larger scale compositions, though, owe their soul to the British artist John Martin. If you look at John Martin's paintings, which are in the British Art Center at Yale and in the museums in England, he will paint a series of expulsion and cataclysmic scenes. And in fact, in Cole's own time, there were certain whispers of visual plagiarism that they all managed to, I think, settle amicably over a drink. And basically decided that imitation was the sincerest form of flattery rather than something you should be getting upset over. But Cole clearly was borrowing a great deal from what John Martin was doing at exactly the same time in England. These are sort of their large-scale Cecil B. DeMille-like sort of scenes of death and destruction. And what's interesting to me is that when Cole does the oil sketch, go back to what Wright of Derby has done. There's your moon, which wasn't in the other picture. There's your volcano. So basically, Eden is tucked away over here, which now looks suspiciously like the American West, although Cole certainly couldn't have known that. This looks like the molten furnace out of what John Ferguson Weir will do. Adam and Eve aren't there yet because Cole's working out the landscape in the oil sketch. But it's this sense of that it's the weather and the terrain that carry the meaning in the landscape that gets carried all the way forward into the Civil War. Yes?
I wanted to return to the meteors.
Yes.
And I wonder if, it seems like that meteor, from your description of it, from the poets,
Yes.
and the painters, it was an abolitionist meteor. Were there any counter representations by the South, by more Confederate-leaning painters of that meteor? Was I don't know, was that meteor just in a certain area that it wouldn't have appealed to?
That's a fantastic question. Actually, the trick with working with the Civil War is trying to find equivalencies north and south, because the art market is in such totally different economic conditions once the war starts that it becomes difficult to compare apples and apples. This meteor was visible up and down the eastern seaboard. The following week, in fact, it was covered in the press. But the following week, there was another meteor visible over Louisville, Kentucky, and the Louisville paper said, we had a southern meteor last week to counter the effects of your northern meteor from the week before. You know, the war hasn't even started yet, and they're already basically going toe-to-toe over whose meteors are better than somebody else's meteors. It verges on the comical, except that there seems to be so much at stake, as though literally it's like, you think God's on your side because of this meteor? Well, we have a meteor that says, we'll see you and raise you one. So there is this sense that they are both looking for justifications on this. And actually, as I went through I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to whoever started the impulse to start digitizing and keyword searching 19th century newspapers. May I just say thank you? Because it allows me to look at newspapers in Charleston, Richmond, Louisville, New Orleans, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and really understand how they are dealing with these things in real time and what metaphors they are using to describe the world literally coming apart around them. And what interests me is that landscape and the weather the things that govern their lives, the terrain and the weather in which you are operating, that is the vocabulary that you are seeing and you are reading in songs and sermons and poems and broadsides and editorials, so that you are saturated in this. Meteors are convenient, and this one in particular, because it is so strange, is the one that captures their attention. But I think that, yes, the South used the same metaphors to justify their own behavior that the North did to justify theirs, and then it's a matter of who shouts loudest. There is a wonderful book. Terry Dopp Amont wrote a book called Righteous Army's Holy Cause, which is about how both sides end up using the Bible in order to justify their positions throughout the war. It is a fabulous book because she really does dig into letters and journals, published accounts, and she balances North and South, I think, in a way that very few people have been able to do. Part of our problem is the Southern economy. Once the war starts, the blockades go into effect. The Southern economy is in shambles within 6 months. They can barely outfit their soldiers. No one is buying works of art. If you're an artist, you are in uniform because that is the only way that you're going to get fed and paid. There are artists in Richmond who literally put buckets underneath their pictures and are accepting donations for the Southern cause, but they're literally trying to keep body and soul together because no one is able to actually pay for the work of art to put it in their house. And that situation will survive until the 1880s, until well into the lost cause. And the first signs that the Southern economy is on the rebound is when communities begin starting campaigns to fund public sculpture, and that's why there are so many Confederate soldier monuments throughout the South. They're not buying paintings for their houses, they're buying monuments for their city streets as a way of dealing with the war and its aftermath. A lot of artists simply go underground during the war, or they go into service as topographical engineers for the Confederate Army, and the lucky ones end up in Charleston or New Orleans, where there is enough of an economically stable base that they are at least able to paint for the Army, if not for private clients. So we're a little bit hampered during the war years because the sheer volume of output in the North so far outstrips what we know that was created during the South, that for every 10 pictures in the North, maybe we have one in the South. So we run the risk of drawing the wrong conclusions, which is why primary sources from newspapers and letters and diaries is so critical in order to understand mindsets. Yes, sir.
Two comments or observations, if you would. One is, my memory tells me we saw one image of one black person in the images you showed. And I appreciate the question about where were the Southern artists. That was something, and about the role or place of blacks in the imagery.
Yes.
And the second is, when you listed the members of the Lunar Club, the
Yes.
Lunar Society, virtually every name I recognized was also a prominent abolitionist.
Yes.
And the idea of the war between science and religion that comes out of this.
Yes, it does.
And also the comparison of Arkwright's Mill, Darby's paintings of dark satanic mills,
Yes.
which is the opposition of North and South by some of the interpretation. If I know you only had 1 hour for your great lecture, but if you would comment on either or both of those
Happy
subjects,
to.
I'd appreciate it.
I would be happy to. This is always the issue when I orient a talk around landscape painting. Most of my landscape painters were miserably bad figure painters. There's a reason they went into landscape painting. When the figures get bigger than about this, they start to lose their anatomical persuasiveness. And so what you end up with are a lot of unpeopled landscapes. Fully half of the exhibition that I did on the Civil War in American art dealt with the issue of how blacks were understood, represented, and treated during and after the war years. And so it's always a little painful to me when that question comes up because it's a totally legitimate question. There are no black people in these pictures, but they occupy a pivotal role in the northern landscape and a different role in the southern landscape, which is a whole different lecture, which I would love to come back and do. Frank, you're never getting rid of me. Because frankly, that is a big story about representation. And in fact, I'm working with a doctoral candidate right now who is looking at diaries kept by former slaves who were in households were rich enough to have paintings that literally showed themselves either in the livery of the house at Mount Vernon or working in the fields further into the plantations. And what does it mean to see yourself represented in that way? And then what happens to those paintings once the war starts, which is really not a pretty story, but not an unexpected one either. And so we are just now beginning to recapture in a more three-dimensional way that story. But yes, there are actually narratives that were written by escaped slaves that talk about landscape representing freedom. And David Blight wrote a wonderful book called A Slave No More. Actually, he wrote the introduction to it, as he said, when he published a book on race and the Civil War, he was contacted by two families who had been holding on to these first-person narratives literally since the 19th century, not quite knowing what to do with them, and they said, you are clearly the person who knows what to do with this. And the great thing about those two narratives, one of a man who escaped from a plantation outside of New Orleans, it took him 7 tries to get away. The other 6, it was not pretty when he got dragged back to the plantation. And the second one was a household slave in Fredericksburg, Virginia, who simply walks away and who makes it to the Union lines and into Washington, D.C. Their stories are, in one sense, completely different because their life experiences are different, but the shared narrative, the talk about the sky, the flowers, the grass, the trees, and how they talked about the experience of being in nature. Even the swamp is viewed as a friend because it means the dogs can't track you through the water. It means that these stupid white guys, get lost in the swamp, and there are a network of escaped slaves in most of the swamps, including the Great Dismal, or perhaps even especially the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of North Carolina and Virginia, who literally have kind of a separate society who are passing people along as part of, they don't even know about the Underground Railroad. They just know that they're passing people through in order to get them out of harm's way. Those two narratives were not messed with by a well-intentioned white editor during the 19th century. A lot of slave narratives get dressed up, prettied up, spell-checked. These two did not. They were raw, handwritten manuscripts, and they are powerful and compelling documents, and that's a great book to sit down with, too. As far as their depiction in the landscapes, Winslow Homer and Eastman Johnson are the two people that you would obviously expect to have front and center, and in fact, they played a central role in my exhibition. I would say that for every Church or Gifford in the landscape end of the exhibition, there was a Homer or an Eastman Johnson on the other side, and the exhibition itself, to my great satisfaction, really brought the two sides into equilibrium and addressed that very question. Your second question, I'm sorry, art, science, and abolition. Yes, there are a lot of, Frederick Douglass will go to England, Harriet Beecher Stowe will do her book tour in England and the Netherlands. They are all finding abolitionist sympathies in England, particularly actually in Scotland, which is looking, again, as they are now, to the issue of independence. It was very much on their minds even in the 19th century. And so what you find is a climate that they're happy to process Southern cotton, but they're also appalled at the idea of doing it with slave labor. Obviously, Henry Adams is sent to England to try to keep England neutral. During the Civil War, his job is to keep an eye on Lord Palmerston and the British Parliament and make sure that they and the French are not planning to jump in, particularly if it's on the side of the Confederacy, because the longer they can keep Europe neutral, the better chance the North has to win the day. And in fact, that's usually held to be the reason that Lincoln chooses the questionable victory at Antietam for the announcement of the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation, because it's enough of a victory and it's timed to keep England and France on the sidelines. Because once he declares that there will be an Emancipation Proclamation going into full effect January 1st, England and France are like, okay, fine. They're working on it. There's no need to actually acknowledge the Confederacy as a separate nation because the North is finally willing to do the one thing that they weren't willing to do at the outset. which is a really long digression on that. What is interesting, though, is that Priestley will end up in the United States. He'll get chased out. He will, of course, discover oxygen, something that we're all pretty grateful for. But the British king in the late 1700s was none too happy about the Lunar Society, and it doesn't end well for some of them. But you know, James Watt and Michael and Matthew Bolton and Priestley will all be in communication with American scientists. Lavoisier will, of course, lose his head in the French Revolution, not because he's a revolutionary, but because he's a tax collector in addition to being a scientist, and no, that doesn't end well either. It's a powerful group of people whose influence in America is one of those 6 degrees of separation where it would be a really intriguing exercise to track the Lunar Society members and their influence here in the United States, to try to understand sort of how those tentacles reach forward into the era when abolition becomes on the front burner here in the United States. My next project is on the influence of the German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt in America. I'm looking literally at the intersection of art and science, politics, abolition, and exploration, really trying to understand how those 6 weeks in 1804, when he and Thomas Jefferson are communing over fossilized mastodon teeth and discussing the web of being, and Charles Wilson Peale is giddy with excitement, taking him back and forth from the White House to the American Philosophical Society in Pennsylvania, and how those 6 weeks end up shaping both our approach to nature as a compelling force around which we orient our culture, but also the urge for exploration, but also Humboldt's ideas on abolition, which is that the color of a man's skin has no bearing on his intelligence or his capabilities, which for 1826 is fabulously early. My favorite moment with Jefferson is when he says, "I feel like I am half American. This is a great country, but you really need to get rid of slavery." And then he writes him a letter saying, "I may have overstepped. You are, after all, the president, but seriously, get rid of it." And so it's nice to have Humboldt writing letters to Wendell Garrett's Liberator, getting published in the New York Evening Post, and in 1858 he will be declared the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's Man of the Year. So I'm kind of looking forward to unpacking Humboldt's brain and seeing where it takes me. It's going to take a while, but I'm looking forward to it. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm thinking about something very dramatic for painting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know in the Civil War how much this was done. That would be the flashes of cannon and rifles, especially as darkness falls. Well, I didn't see it referenced here, but were artists just not there? In ship battles that same or earlier, certainly artists weren't present.
Yeah.
Lots of drama of the gun flash and the battle.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing that I discovered when I started working on this project, and that is there are only a handful of pictures of actual battle scenes painted during the war. Once you get to the centennial, and we've supposedly put this behind us and wrapped up the first 100 years with a bow and had a kumbaya moment, then the gloves are off, and we reinvent the Civil War freely, and at that point, guns go off, rifles, cannons, it's like the Rockets' red glare all over again. And the conclusion to which I came when I realized that there were only a handful of pictures showing combat is that there's no market for pictures of Americans killing each other. It's kind of a downer over the fireplace. And so this isn't the revolution where you send the British packing. This is brother against brother. This is the fist fight at the family reunion, and the holidays are coming, and we still haven't figured this out yet, and oh my God, what are we gonna do? And so you kick it to the curb and you don't deal with it. There are a few pictures in which there are puffs of smoke at the ends of rifles. Homer's sharpshooter is clearly aiming at someone who cannot see him. If you look then, and I don't have this with me, but there is a picture in the Detroit Institute of Arts called Defiance, basically inviting the first shot, and it's probably the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg, Virginia. And there's the, young, stupid Confederate with the slouch hat on top of the earthworks, daring the Union guys to go after him. And in the distance, there are two white puffs, and you know that they're a pair of sharpshooters. And so you get that. Conrad Wise Chapman, when he is painting for P.T. Beauregard in Charleston, South Carolina in 1863, he is watching the shelling by the Union Army trying to break through into the harbor, and he will paint an exploding shell, with the same color palette, actually, as this. It is literally, it looks like something is beginning to blow up over somebody's head. But it actually doesn't show up very often until about a decade after the war's end. And my goal with this exhibition was to do the war without the benefit of hindsight. I really didn't want to be told 10 years later what it all meant. I wanted to know, in the middle of a war, when you don't know how it's going, how long it's going to last, who's winning, or what happens next, what do you paint? You know, you don't know who the good guys are. You don't know who the heroes are. You don't know what the pivot points are yet. I want to know how it is you are dealing with this kind of sense of fragmentation, you know, literally in real time. The three things that I've discovered about post-Civil War pictures of the Civil War is, you know, they're inventing it when the horses are healthy, the uniforms are clean, and it's not raining. Because based on everything I read about the Civil War, those three things went off the table really fast. And so for all of the people who paint these heroic Napoleonic pictures of the Civil War, usually on horseback with sabers raised, it's like, no, this is about long-range weapons and shrapnel. And that's one of the reasons it doesn't get painted in a romantic idiom, because it takes time to realize they weren't, in fact, fighting that way. But it's a lot more fun to paint it like it's the Napoleonic Wars. So yeah, if you compare post-Civil War paintings and Civil War paintings, the brutality in the ones painted in real time is breathtaking and unpleasant. The highly charged, beautiful romanticism later, you pretty much know what you're getting. It's not that hard to figure it out. Well, I want to thank you very, very much for spending the afternoon with me. I appreciate it. I hope you have spent a lot of time in Night Vision. Frank and Ann Goodyear have put together a really terrific exhibition. I had the pleasure of touring it this morning, and it's an extraordinary and thoughtful exhibition and accompanying book. So my congratulations to them and to Joachim for putting together an exhibition that will have lasting merit in the field, but also give you something really wonderful to look at while you're doing it. Thank you.